maybe that will manifest in multiple ways for you today, hopefully positive. All right, let's talk about notes from undergrad. We have a single session on this today. This is our third author in this Modernism, Masterpieces in Metempsychosis course, and we are getting closer and closer to true modernism. We see Fyodor Dostoevsky, Russian, 1821 to 1881, about 40 years removed from true modernism by the end of his life. And the work that we are considering today, which there's an error on the slides, it was published in 1864. And so about 30 years after the completion of part 2 of Faust, and about 250 years after the completion of Don Quixote. The next work we'll be reading, Ulysses, was itself finished in the early 1920s. And so this is about 60 years prior to one of the premier texts in modernism. And so I present to you today our third author, our third empire. This is a figure from the Russian Empire, rather than the Holy Roman Empire, rather than the Spanish Empire. And his name is Fyodor Dostoevsky. Something just to keep in mind about him, I'm going to go through these slides because there are all sorts of valuable nuggets in them, is that he lived a very, very difficult life. His life was marred by crime and tragedy. And sometimes when people think of Russian authors, they think of somebody like a Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, Anna Karenina, fantastic works. Anna Karenina is better than War and Peace. But people are more impressed by hearing that you've read War and Peace. Leo Tolstoy was an elite who had made it at a young age, very like Thomas Mann had as well, who we will encounter soon. Fyodor Dostoevsky, well, I'll go through his chronology. But because of his political beliefs, right at the end of his schooling, right when he's a little bit older than you, he gets taken to prison for several years. And this is a Russian prison, so it's in Siberia. So it's very, very cold. I've lived in a place called Milwaukee before, where one regularly sees -10, -15 temperatures with -30, -40 wind chills. Siberia can be like 20 or 30 degrees colder than that, which is unbelievably cold. I remember walking through the wind with Lake Michigan's winds coming right down Wisconsin Avenue in Milwaukee and thinking I was going to die as I walked. And I just thought, this pain is unbelievable, because I was from California in the South, not very cold places. And that's where he had to spend several years around several hardened criminals. In fact, he wrote a work about that called House of the Dead. And it's a very sad work too, especially if you're like an animal lover or even a human lover. He talks about various animals that make their way into the prisons, like dogs. You know, I'm a dog lover. I have 2 dogs, and the terrible things that happen to them. I'll give you a small. This isn't truly worthy of a trigger warning per se, but one of the dogs that he loves is skinned by one of his fellow inmates. And so this is a very real, gritty work. It makes you feel. You think about your own animals at home. If one of them were to be taken by somebody and skinned, and then they showed you the shoes that they made based on their pelt. Can you imagine the feeling of rage and hate you might have for such a person? This is what Dostoevsky is master of, portraying negative situations, perhaps even evil situations, and the emotions that are consequent to it. The emotion that we feel strongest from Notes from Underground is resentment. Resentment in everything. Philosophy, one's friends, the structure of one's own very existence. It is a work that moves backwards from the 1860s to the 1840s, moves from the nihilism, sometimes called nihilism, from the Latin word nihil, which means nothing. Nothing from nothing comes is a very famous Latin quote, ex nihilo nihil fit, from nothing ex nihilo nihil fit, nothing will come fit, future, in the Latin language. And so it moves from nihilism to romanticism. So something that we encounter in Notes from Underground that we saw the beginnings of in Goethe's Faust are these romantic notions. And something you will observe is that in moving from the future to the past, or the present to the past, This underground man, you do not get his name, for those of you thinking about modernism, he is called the Underground Man. He's given the title for Don Quixote, perhaps also like Faust. Something I should tell you about Faust's name, that Faustus is actually a term in Latin. It means lucky or fortunate. And so we get to see this underground man move in reverse from the nihilism of his early 40s to the romanticism of his 20s, and add another element that connects this text to both Faust and Don Quixote. He is constantly comparing the nature of his life to the nature of the lives he has read in books. So I would say there is immediately a very strong connection to Don Quixote, where we know that Don Quixote loses his mind because of the literature he's reading. And you want to think about that for 1 second. I don't say the nonfiction books he's reading. I don't say the learning that he has attained to. I say the fiction books. It's as if the imaginative character, the fictional falsities within this text corrupt his mind. And then in Faust, a little bit different, little different. Faust is a learned scholar, not just a gentleman of leisure who's reading. He has mastered theology and philosophy and medicine, and yet he is world weary. It does not satisfy him. There's something more to the world. This is a little bit different from being driven crazy by reading, and yet there is still a connection between the impetus for his story and books and being surrounded, or you might say that what Faust encounters is that you cannot live a meaningful life within the pages of a book, whereas Don Quixote attempts to take that from books and make it into the world. He tries to take the ink from the pages, spread it out into the world with similar effects that if you were to throw ink all over people around you, creates quite a bit of a mess. Ink doesn't come out of things very well, by the way. Any of you ever know that? Any of you ever had a pen explode in your pants or something like that? It's terrible, gone. Okay, let me say some, I won't say more mundane things, but some more straightforward things. Fyodor Dostoevsky, and this is how you say his name. If you ever see it spelled differently with like a Y, two Y's or something like that, this is because the Cyrillic alphabet has 33 or 34 letters, depending on which version of it you write. And so there aren't direct translations of names letter by letter from Russian to, or any Cyrillic language like Ukrainian, to English. Same thing with Arabic too. You may have seen old representations of like Muslim, whereas we spell Muslim like Muslim now, or Mohammed as a version to, as opposed to Muhammad, or something like that. That's because all of these scripts use differing letters, and so we sort of phonetically try and figure out which letters we would use in English in order to represent Arabic or Russian names. All that goes to say is, don't be intimidated by his name. Don't worry if you see it spelled in slightly different ways because of the conventions of language. In any case, he was born 11 November 1821 in Moscow, Russia, died 9 February 1881 in St. Petersburg, often called Petersburg. These are the two biggest, most major cities in Russia, by the way. And so this was a very cosmopolitan, urban individual. He was a Russian novelist and short story writer. Moving into these final 4 texts, they are in fact all 4 novels. So if you wish to call Notes from Underground a novel, it is. It's called Ulysses, Mrs. Dalloway, the Magic Mountain novels, they are. The texts before them are called texts. You can make an argument that Don Quixote is a novel. You cannot really make a good argument that Faust is a novel. And you really would have to kind of argue for what genre it is. Play, poem, ploem of some sort of hybrid as we've talked about. But these are novels, so feel free to and feel safe in calling them such. We have made it into the 19th century. The novel is now an existent thing with conventions applied to it. All right. He was a Russian novelist and short story writer. He was not landed gentry. This means highfalutin or high-class individual like Leo Tolstoy or his sort of competitor from the generation before named Ivan Turgenev, Fathers and Sons, or Fathers and Children, as it's sometimes translated. He was a modernist, an existentialist, a psychologist, a theologian, and a literary critic. In fact, one of the great 19th century philosophers named Friedrich Nietzsche. There's also a name that's really a bugbear for trying to write out the first time. I will write it for you because I just happen to know it. He's got that Z in there lurking. Friedrich Nietzsche said that the only psychologist he needed to read was Dostoevsky. Friedrich Nietzsche is himself the sort of philosopher that there are many philosophy departments full of scholars who read almost exclusively just him. So his praise as one of the top-notch philosophers in sort of the tradition, as it were, for Dostoevsky, does something to lend gravity and depth to our notions of Dostoevsky, or at least inclines us more towards, if this great thinker sees something very deep and meaningful in this other thinker, perhaps we are more likely to look for it ourselves. He was himself a student of engineering and became a civil servant for a short time. I should say he did become an engineer, but he was known for still writing stories and not taking it very seriously during his time getting his education. While writing, and also he became an epileptic. To be an epileptic means that you have epileptic seizures, often manifesting in grand mal seizures, where you do something like you perceive something called a corona, not the beer, la vida más fina, and then you, at least for Dostoevsky, this is part of what makes him sort of a strange and perhaps magnificent writer. He described the experience as having a wave of euphoria, like taking a drug or having a religious experience. And it was such a profound experience, he said, before he would then fall and seize. A very scary thing for people who witness happening to you, but also to experience. Sometimes you have people from swallowing their own tongues when they do this sort of thing. He said that he wouldn't give up those experiences for anything. Small paraphrase, but he was something like a holy writer in that way. And epilepsy was sometimes described as the holy sickness, because it's like God himself or an angel or a devil came down to you and then possessed your body, took you out of your mind for some amount of time. And also it took us a long time to find the mechanism that controlled that. You should keep in mind that a lot of mental illnesses and illnesses themselves did seem like blights and curses because we didn't have the biology necessary yet as a science to understand, that, like, say, cancer is an infinite culture of cells. That's how it's described. That cells never stop reproducing. Problem. They work until you die, and then they die. But that's the mechanism by which they work. In any case, he was an epileptic, and so something to keep in mind, and he considered that very valuable to himself. Some say that it was not until he developed epilepsy that he became a great writer. And one thought is that he didn't natively have epilepsy, but that he developed it while he was imprisoned in Siberia due to the brutal conditions that he was suffering, both from his fellow prison inmates, as well as from, of course, the natural conditions that were there as well. As a young person, he was part of what was called the Petrushevsky Circle, which was a political organization based on what was called left Hegelianism. G.W.F. Hegel was the major German philosopher, Prussian, from the early 18th century, and is, in fact, to this day, considered one of the greatest 4 or 5 philosophers to have existed. He, opposite to some extent from, how would I say opposite from what I say is good writing for you, to occupy a subjective perspective, and perhaps some of the claims of modernism itself, he strove to have a philosophy of that pursued the absolute ideal. It's very Platonic in its way. He was one of the first, after Immanuel Kant, systems philosophers. He came up with what he considered a perfect system for understanding both subjectivity and objectivity. And in so understanding both of these concepts, one could have a universal complete view of the all, as it were. You can see also romantic elements in Hegel's desire to understand the absolute or the ideal. This is itself sort of a replacement idea for the notion of a divinity or God, right? And so these left Hegelians got political, and they wanted to reform Russian society. And in particular, you should know that Russian society, like American society in the middle of the 19th century, still had slaves. They were called serfs. We get the word serve. And the word for slave from Latin is servus. So the word servant, in fact, comes from the word for slave. You can see how we just kind of appropriate and change language as we move on in order to try and change the valence of words without changing the actual rank of the individuals called. And this is something that we do. In any case, he wanted to change the world. He wanted to make the world better. He believed in the freedom of the serfs. And the serfs were eventually freed in the early 1860s. But because of his political machinations, he was arrested. Oh yeah, here we are. Difference between the 1840s social romanticism and the 1860s nihilism in Russia. You can see a change in how society sees itself. You understand that in the 1840s, there would be this is very much an anachronistic analogy, but there might be movies about Superman in the 1840s, where Superman is becoming Superman, right? Where Spider-Man is becoming Spider-Man. There's all this hope. Look, this new superhero is going to help. He's taking this form, this great. This 1860s is more like Justice League, more like dark Superman. Superman is now a fascist Superman, taking over the world or something like that. Or in a nihilist way, it'd be more like Superman lives on the moon and doesn't care about what's happening on the earth. The representation even of the heroes of the culture would reflect the movements that are floating through the air. You can tell even about our culture. Look at our representations of superheroes. Are they light and easy and all good, or are they grittier now, more psychological, more interesting? You might even look at the types of superheroes that get represented. You more often say Superman these days, or you see more Batman. These are very different concepts of what a hero is, and the sort of life that a person goes through, right? One small town, Kansas, moves to metropolis someday, very 1950s American sort of way of looking at things or way of being brought up. Whereas, you know what, Batman, his parents are killed and he's very rich. It's sort of much darker life to consider. Though, of course, Superman's world was blown up. Something to keep in mind. In any case, Dostoevsky was taken, this story. This is part of the reason I'm giving this lecture, so that you know this about this man. So because of his political beliefs, and I might get a detail or two here while paraphrasing, not exact, but this can be looked up, this is well known. Dostoevsky was abducted in the night by the police force that was operating in the 19th century. It was at the order of the Tsar. Supposedly, the Tsar is basically the dictator, the king of the Russians. He was taken before a shooting squad. And so I really need to lay this out a little bit like a play. He's taken in front of a wall, blindfolded. I don't think he was naked, but he wasn't well dressed. The guns were loaded, cocked, and then in that moment, what do you know? What do you know? Absolutely, in this moment, blindfolded. He'd been in prison for months, by the way, 8 or 9 months, and at the time, the notion that he would be given an execution order for his political beliefs, that's like you getting an execution order for your political beliefs. It was unbelievable to him. He was young, in his 20s, just out of school, and he's standing up for what he believed, but he didn't. It's not like he lived under a later regime like the Nazi or fascist regime. And so he gets this shocking conviction. Seems very unjust. And he's put in front of a wall early morning. He knows definitely what's going to happen. There's no way out. What's going to happen to him? They're going to shoot him. He's going to die. And yet, they then commute his sentence at the last possible moment. Apparently, this was all evil theater, political theater. And he survives. One of the men that was with him went irremediably crazy because of the experience. And some scholars think that because of the shock of the experience, this is what led to Dostoevsky's epilepsy. It literally messed with his mind going through such a situation. And then he's sent to Siberia for several years to be unjustly imprisoned for the beliefs he maintained as a young philosophical individual. So his life goes from looking, pretty good. It's going to be this bourgeois, middle-class individual, likes to write, going to be an engineer, has some political beliefs, and boom, execution order, taken in front of a wall to be shot up into Siberia with hardened criminals for years. This is, again, like you being sent to a maximum security prison for writing something on Facebook. A couple of times. It's like you might say, well, I didn't think it was maybe the best thing to write, but I didn't think I would lose years and years of my life because of it. And yet, these are the costs that he had to bear. So when he writes about the negative emotions and the negative, envious, resentful ways that humans can look at themselves in the world, know that he knows these emotions, that these emotions were in some way imposed upon him. But so he was taken before a shooting squad, but the sentence was commuted at the last moment. 1849, he sent to Siberia for 4 years of compulsory military service. When Dostoevsky was 28, he was arrested in the pre-dawn hours by the Tsar's political police 9 months later. Think about that, being held without being charged for 9 years. This is a problem that we have litigating, legally speaking, with, like, say, prisoners of war that we put in Guantanamo Bay. How long can we keep them there? They don't seem to have right of habeas corpus, which is the right to be treated with political rights. So they can be kept there for how long? Forever. It's one of those typical difficult situations. Somebody is a political criminal and they're identified no longer as a citizen, but as an enemy of the state. They stop having rights within the state. They have international rights, but say the nation that is imposing the political imprisonment is the United States. What nation is going to keep them from doing what they want? There are zero nations that can do that at this particular time. And so, if, say, you were charged with domestic terrorism for some reason and taken to Guantanamo, God knows how long you would stay there. There would be people who would try and fight for your civil rights, but there are still people at Guantanamo Bay that are related, that were implicated or involved in the 2001 bombing of the two towers. So that's something to keep in mind. And that is, I would say, similar in some ways, but very different from what Dostoevsky went through. The imprisonment for an indefinite amount of time is similar. The reasons for becoming imprisoned, obviously. Okay, Dostoevsky was then saved from the firing squad by a last-minute reprieve. This is prior to him going to Siberia, obviously. He was released from the labor camp. Keep in mind, it's a labor camp, so he's working physically grueling labor all day long in the cold. And then he worked as a soldier on the Mongolian frontier and returned to Russia in 1859. There with his brother, whom he loved very much, and who tragically died within a year of his wife during a very trying period of his time. Again, this is a very tragic, tough life. He founded a magazine. I believe that magazine was called Epoch. At least that was one of the magazines that he worked on with his brother. And then he traveled to Europe for the first time. 1864 and 1865, there we are. His brother died 1864, happens to be the publication date of this work, by the way. So keep that in mind. His wife and brother died, and his magazine folded, and his debts increased. Something about Dostoevsky. So he wasn't just sitting in his study writing like a Montaigne, who sat in a circular office and just kind of pondered the world, or like a Ralph Waldo Emerson, who one imagines sitting near Cambridge out on the grass, and his wife, second wife, bringing out some tea or coffee for him to drink. Dostoevsky was a rabid gambler. He would have had a lot of trouble on the Gulf Coast, and he often increased huge debts that he then secured against payments he would receive for novels he wrote if he wrote them by their deadline. So keep this in mind. He would have these strict deadlines to write novels by. If he did not meet the deadlines, he would not receive the payment necessary to pay off the debts that he had already accumulated. So consider the pressure and stress that he put himself under. The same sort of Similar to the stress you put yourself under if you have not started your essay, it is 3 a.m. on Thursday, and you know you have 3 hours and 30 minutes or so to get this done and then send it in, and then that's a huge pressure void. Well, imagine that you have very real debts and very real people coming to collect those debts, and then you have a very real publisher who's willing to pay you only under the condition that you meet the deadline. And so you have all of these moving pieces, and you need to keep them all straight. And well, that tends to create a lot of stress for people. Those are not the easiest conditions under which to write, I would say, and yet those are the conditions under which this person wrote. So not only does he have a dynamic and interesting, youthful existence, going to jail, having sort of an execution staged for him, but then his very life continues to be stressful and sort of out of order as well. And obviously, he writes drinkers very well as he writes gamblers very well. In fact, one of his works is called, so his first work was called Poor People. I think that's the only work of his that I haven't read. People say of him, A New Gogol has appeared, Dead Souls, also a work from the generation before Dostoevsky's. This work is itself a different form of novel from, say, what you may have expected and from what we've seen before. It is what is called an epistolary novel. It is a written novel. We do not meet our narrator face to face, as it were, but rather we find his writings. He has written this as his own narrator. In fact, at the very end, he says, and I'm not going to write on. And then he keeps writing on, and a second narrator appears who cuts him off, as it were. I should be getting to that in just a minute or two here. Something to keep in mind there is that many of the early novels were epistolary novels, letters from one person to another. You can see that there's obviously a conceit that would become very much part of romance novels. Oh, I love you. If only I could get past my terrible husband, or I'm a lady in waiting and I have nothing to offer, but I love you. This and that. Love letters lend themselves, and love lends itself to the epistolary form. Perhaps you know that yourself in the text messages that you have sent to people, or various messages, or even DMs to people on Instagram that you don't know. I know. In any case, The Double, 1846, White Nights. I highly recommend you read that. That's a short story by him. 1848. These all came before his imprisonment. Then his great works came after. The House of the Dead, where he describes his time in prison, 1861, 62. And then boom, these are the 4 great novels that Americans read. Crime and Punishment, 1866, about a man who thought he was Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch and wishes to commit a murder without feeling. And he fails to do so. The Idiot, 1869, about a character who's himself modeled off of both Jesus Christ and Don Quixote. Demons, also called The Possessed, it's translated as both in English, 1872. It is very much about the coming of socialism to Russia and the violent ways that it manifested prior to the revolution, and the incompetence of some of the players in the game. And then his greatest work is Brothers Karamazov, 1880, and he died a year later, very similar to Cervantes and his conclusion to Don Quixote, very similar to Goethe, his conclusion to Faust, all died within a year of their final works. Brothers Karamazov was a huge success. In fact, there's an adaptation of it that was written, at least in the past, I think in the past 30, 40 years, called The Brothers K, which is often what people who have read the Brothers Karamazov call it, as Russian words sometimes being difficult for English speakers to pronounce. I include this picture because I think this is the right picture to look at when you think of Dostoevsky. Again, I've told you that I don't partake of phrenology, which is the study of one's intelligence by looking at one's cranial aberrations, nor also physiognomy, which is the study of one's character by the look of one's face. But I think the ghastly way that he is represented does give you some insight into the life that he did live and the appropriate way to interpret the person who is writing. This skull-like face looks like a face that has suffered. And so it may not be the case in some odd picture of Dorian Gray way that one's actions do not affect one's face. Arthur Schopenhauer says that one's face is actually the representation of all the thoughts one has ever had. I think that's very interesting. In Dorian Gray, evil things that one does affect one's face. So in that case, it affects a piece of art instead of one's face. One imagines in looking at Dostoevsky, very rarely, if ever, represented as smiling. That one is seeing the tension in his being, the tension in his soul, speaking more poetic. So I include that. So Notes from Underground itself. It was first published in 1864 in 2 installments in Dostoevsky's journal Epoch, very similar to Charles Dickens' work. It was often got to such size because it was published periodically in periodicals, newspapers, over and over, or literature. It was a response itself to Nikolai G. Chernyshevsky's novel, What Is to Be Done, from 1863, the year before, where an enlightened man with reason and science constructs a perfect society. Think about the relationship between that notion and what Faust attempts to do at the end of part 2 of Faust. Also, Chernyshevsky's article, The Anthropological Principle in Philosophy, which came out in 1860, flatly argues that there's no such thing as free will. There's such things as agency. Even if you think that you are making a choice. In fact, the physical determinants that have all gone in a line before you make the choice that have already determined it for you. We've done some research into this, neuroscientists have, and in the last couple of years, and it's tough to really pin down these notions because they're philosophical rather than scientific. They actually found they found activity in the part of the brain responsible for making decisions seconds before somebody reported having made the decision. Which is very interesting for biological determinants, which many people argue these. In any case, Dostoevsky believed not that man was predetermined, but that man was evil, rational, capricious. And this is very different from him. This is very different from him and most modernist authors, even Joyce. He believed faith, thought this was a faithless, godless class. Dostoevsky is your saving grace. He thought that faith beyond reason in Christ would help one master one's impulses. He was a Russian Orthodox. And he, unlike many of the modernist philosophers surrounding him at the time, did not believe that philosophy, science, could perfect the human soul and perfect human society. He thought humans were subject to original sin, were naturally evil, had to make themselves better, and that no science could improve somebody, but simply faith. This is a bizarre way of looking at the world for a modernist, and yet this infuses very much his writing. His lack of belief in the power of philosophy and science is bolstered by his belief in religion. One thing strange I'll say to you about how he reflects his own people is that when Stalin came about after Lenin in the inception of the USSR, the Soviet republics, Soviet Republic as it were, it was itself a collection like the United States, is that, of course, in communist systems, you know that they do away with religion. And to this day, China admits of no religion, even their historical Confucianism and Buddhism. Not allowed, and especially not Christianity. And so after the USSR collapsed, the people started returning to their religion. This is something Vladimir Putin to this day talks about. He says, I didn't impose religion on these people. And he's former KGB agent, or FSB. So you can take that with a grain of salt, cum grano salis. And yet, it does seem that the Russian people, in being given more freedom, at least than they had under the Soviets, have returned to traditional religion. There's a religiosity in the people that Dostoevsky seems to reflect even 140 years before that. And perhaps that suggests to you, if you want to become a scholar and really study these sorts of things, perhaps that suggests to you that there is something about religion and its connection to a people that cannot be eradicated even by the most powerful philosophical and political forms. In any case, this is also, okay, yeah, here's a quote from Dostoevsky. In one famous letter, he describes how he thirsts for faith. That's a powerful image. The thirst is really a strong feeling, like a parched grass, and concludes, if someone proved to me that Christ is outside the truth, and that in reality, the truth were outside of Christ, and I should prefer to remain with Christ rather than with the truth. It's fantastic. It's exactly what you should hear from somebody who is a believer, as it were. So this work is written in two parts, two tableaux from the underground man's life. That means two images from his life, two short episodes. Keep this in mind when we're talking about late. So we're given two very clear, very concentrated images from his life, rather than elongated narratives in which one can be lost. Keep this in mind when you think about criticisms of long narratives. Can the author lose you? Can the author lose the thread of the point? Can they be so complicated and intermixed that you lose the taste of the individual elements? Think of jambalaya. You taste all the things in jambalaya or gumbo, or do you taste gumbo in jambalaya? Stir fry too, if you're not an eater of Cajun food. Any sort of soup or stew. Do you taste a single unity with a bunch of things in it? Or do you taste all the individual parts? This is why stew is often considered a lower food than foods where you can eat the individual parts. You eat it when it's winter and you're cold. All right, like Faust and Don Quixote, it has two parts, but the chronology works backwards. Part one, about the underground man that's a 40-year-old in the 1860s, now a nihilist, reflecting the social mores of his time, the philosophical mores. So part two is about him in his 20s, the 1840s, social romanticism. It moves backwards. There's much you could do with that. Why does it move backwards? Is it because thought moves backwards from 1840s to 1860s? Is it like the world or society itself moves backwards? Or is the idea to show you the person you would not want to be, show you how you become that person? That might be of value too. I'm going to tell you my story, says the old crippled man. You think, I would like neither to be old, which I might not have a lot of control over, but definitely not crippled, which I hope I have some control over. So please do tell me your perhaps valuable story. In any case, it immediately preceded the writing of Crime and Punishment, one of the great four novels of Dostoevsky. Oh, you may ask, you said the four great novels of Dostoevsky in America. Europeans often don't read The Idiot. They read another work of his called The Adolescent. And so he has five great, large novels, as it were, though four scenes on differing sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The Underground Man is one of the great modern characters like Hamlet, Don Quixote, Don Juan, and Faust. You will have met all of these by the end of Friday next week after you see Don Giovanni, Don Juan, and also Hamlet. And the cultural moments which claim the Underground Man as their own are Nietzscheanism, based on Friedrich Nietzsche, who we mentioned earlier, Freudianism, Freud and his psychoanalysis, expressionism, surrealism, crisis theology, and existentialism. Very briefly, I need to not explain, but just touch on what existentialism is. Existentialism is a philosophy first put forward in literary form by Dostoevsky, put forward in philosophical form by Nietzsche, put forward in Christian philosophical form by a Danish figure named Søren Kierkegaard, made popular in the 20th century by figures like Sartre, French philosopher, as well as a great French literary writer named, and also philosopher, Albert Camus, as well as many, many, many other writers as well. One dynamic, unique, invaluable thing to know about existentialism is that it says that existence, and this is going to be very different from what we've heard prior to this, precedes, comes before, essence. So we've talked a little bit about the nature of human, and the romantic desire to refashion oneself, to overcome one's limitations, culture, language, body, aging, death, physical limitations. The existentialists say that you are free, you do not have an essence. Even as a human, you might look around and see a bunch of people with heads and two arms and two legs. That's not the essence. A human first exists, and in this claim, you can see the beginnings of postmodernism and post-postmodernism. You can see the beginnings of how people think this in this day. If existence precedes essence, then who defines you? Who makes you what you are? Does the fact that you are a human make you what you are? No, that no longer defines you. You get to choose and make yourself what you are. You have to self-fashion yourself. No angel or God or even DNA or nature or genes will make you into what you are for an existentialist, regardless of what mechanism you put inside or outside yourself, which is outside of your subjective control. It is you who are responsible for defining your essence. And in so making this claim, the existentialists open up a giant Pandora's box for, well, relativism, obviously, but for a redefinition of what a human is and what a human can be. In fact, it is now, to this day, you may have seen this before, you may not because you're not always reading scholarly articles. It is now occasionally an insult to a philosophy to be called essentialist, which means to suggest that humans have ness. This is a radical redefinition of what humans are. And you should really think to yourself, like, am I an existentialist? Do I think, do I believe in infinite variability in our species? Do I not even believe that there's such thing as a species? Because we're all so different. This is like the Thomas Aquinas idea of the angels, that every angel is a different essence and genus. They're not even the same species. They're all totally unique from each other. Is that what you are compared to the other people around you? Do I just call you people, generally speaking, but you're obviously totally unique? Or do you believe that there is something that connects humans together? And this comes down to the realm of ethics, right? How do you live if humans do share a certain ethics? Is there a certain way to behave correctly around people, to do right by them? Or are these notions, like the notions of an essence itself, simply socially defined or externally defined by others? Perhaps, and this is the claim that is made often these days, perhaps by people with great literacy and great power. Does your essence come from within, or do you have power over it yourself? Was I born to be a literature professor, or did I make myself into a literature professor? Or is that too simplistic a way of looking at things? But this philosophy changed the world in a way that it has not unchanged from in the middle of the 19th century through the 20th century and its various iterations. All right. One last comment on the title, and then I'm just going to have to send you to the quotes on reading, which do make sure to look through these. These are very, very useful, particularly when writing and for making connections to Don Quixote. But before we go, comments on the title. I want you to see the metafictionality. The author of these notes and the notes themselves are both, of course, imaginary. All the same, if we take into consideration the conditions that have shaped our society, people like the writer not only may, but must exist in that society. See the determinism here. This person would have come to be in reality, even if they did not. Very like the things they carried Tim O'Brien saying, this is a war story, even though it's not a true story about war, but it's a real story about war. It's an interesting distinction. Not true, but real. I've tried to present to the public in a more striking form than is usual, a character belonging to the very recent past, the Romanticism of the 1840s. A representative figure from a generation still surviving now into the 1860s and nihilism. In the chapter entitled The Underground, this personage introduces himself and his outlook on life and tries, as it were, to elucidate the causes that inevitably brought about that inevitability, right? No agency, determined, would happen no matter what. Inevitably brought about his appearance in our midst. In the second section, we follow the personage's memoirs, some of the happenings in his life. Well, that is where we have to end today because we have run out of time. I'm glad that we got to talk a little bit about Notes from Underground, and we are back to Ulysses, or to Ulysses, as it were,